Welcome back. Welcome back and welcome back. This is the Behind the Bench Network. I'm your host, Jay Shad. This is part three of my series, What is a Super Team? In the last video, quick recap, I talked about the Lakers of the 80s, the Celtics of the 80s. I talked about the Chicago Bulls of the 90s. So let's move into the 2000s because this team right here, you know, a lot of people will say, "Oh, they had a super team." And that's the 2003 2004 Lakers. Let me go ahead and say this again. Shaq, franchise player. Kobe, franchise player. Karl Malone, outside of his being a franchise player. I don't even think he was an all-star. Same thing with GP. They on the outskirts. They're not in the back end of their being a franchise player. They are no longer franchise players at the ages that they were at. The names and they profile used to say franchise player. GP. This ain't GP. When GP came to the Lakers, he wasn't the GP of 25 to 27 points, uh, 11 assists, and 5 to 6 rebounds. GP. This wasn't MVP 98 Karl Malone in his prime. At this time, I believe Karl Malone was at 40. Now, can they give you a game or two? You know, because thing about superstar players, when you're a superstar player, you're supposed to bring it every night. You're supposed to, if you're averaging 28 to 30 points, you're bringing it every night, right? So out of 6 games, 5 games, they're gonna bring it every night. And sometimes 6 out of 6 games, they're gonna bring it every night and hit their averages. On top of their rebounds, on top of their assists. When you are an all-star player, you may hit your average, but out of 6 games, I want to say maybe 4 of those games you hit your average. The other 2 games you're below your average, right? Or you might hit your average, but you didn't do the other things, the rebounding and the assists. You didn't use below that for the night. You see what I'm saying? And then when you got players in their back end, every if you're playing 6 games, 2 of those games they might hit, depending on how many shot attempts they're able to get. So depending on if it's a player in their back end of their prime and it's just them still on that team, they still might get, instead of getting 20 shots, it might trundle down to 16 shots a night, and they're capable of getting their average, but their average done dip from 28 to 20 to 24, 25, and then they're able to get that average, but it's not a consistent. You see what I'm saying? But when you're outside of your prime, you might be able to hit. You might look like your old self 1 out of every 6 games. Okay, so with that said, that Laker team was not a super team. The names were recognizable, and were they Hall of Famers? Why they was playing? Karl Malone was. He was going to be inducted. We knew GP was going to be inducted, but they were still playing at the back end of their prime. And at that period, you knew that those players was going to be a Hall of Fame type of player. Okay? But that Laker team, they was not a super team. The next team that I'm probably going to bring up, um, and I kind of forgot, I'm going to go back a little bit right before the Lakers. It was that Houston Rockets team. I don't believe that I talked about them in the last video, but if I did, I apologize. But I'm going to talk about that Houston Rockets team. And I think I did. So no, I'm not going to even touch that Houston Rockets team with Charles Barkley, Scottie Pippen, and Hakeem Olajuwon. All those players was at the back end of their prime. I mean, two of those players was outside their prime. Scottie Pippen was the only one at the back end of their prime. Was they a super team? No, they wasn't. So, but the next team I want to bring up is, I want to say, the Boston Celtics. Okay, KG, Paul Pierce, Ray Allen. Were they a super team? All three of them was at the back end of their prime. They was still franchised when they first got there. They was at the back end of their prime. If you want to say that was a super team, go right ahead. Do I think it was a super team? No, I looked at them more as a big three because they was at the back end of their prime. Three players at the back end of their prime that done played at least 12 years in the league. It's not a super team, because a super team to me consists of players playing in their prime years, not the back end of their prime. You see what I'm saying? Paul Pierce wasn't. This wasn't Paul Pierce of 2002, 2003, 2004 giving you 27 a night. This ain't KG in 2004 MVP KG that was giving you 27 a night. This wasn't Ray Allen of 2001, 2002 giving you 26 points a night. Nah, all they roles got diminished playing with each other. But they was not efficient as they once was when they was in their prime. They was at the back in their prime, so they wasn't a super team. The next team that I'm gonna bring up is a team that everybody feel like they was a super team, and they was, because it was three players playing in their prime: LeBron, D Wade, Chris Bosh. Those three players had their own franchise. D Wade, own franchise. LeBron, own franchise in Cleveland. Bosh, own franchise in Toronto. Was all NBA players playing in their prime, all under the age of 28 years old. They was in their prime at that time. That was a super team. And then when you add all the other components of other players that they had, from the Rashard Lewises to the Ray Allens, and even though they was outside their prime, they still had good players. You know, the Mike Millers of the world. But that Miami Heat team, super team. Let's talk about OKC. Westbrook, Paul George, and Carmelo. Was that a super team? No. Carmelo was at the back end of his prime. Paul George and Westbrook was in their prime. It's not a super team. Let's talk about that Brooklyn team with Darren Williams back end of his prime. Paul Pierce back in. He probably was outside of his prime. Same thing for KG, outside of his prime. Joe Johnson was outside of his prime. Brook Lopez was in his prime. Super team? No. Recognizable names? Yes. But they was not that. None of those players was in their prime except for Brook Lopez. Everybody else was there. It was a group of old players trying to come together to try to win a ring. That's what that team was. Real quick, let's go to the Golden State Warriors. Steph Curry, Draymond, and Klay Thompson. Was that a super team? No, because Draymond was not a franchise player, and the same thing for Klay Thompson. But I'm going to go ahead and end this video for my TikTok fans. If you want to continue and hear the rest of this series, because I'm bringing it to an end, you can find us on the YouTube channel, which I could go over the 10-minute mark. But until then, I'm going to holler at you, TikTok fans. Now, for everybody else, that team with Draymond, with Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, was that a super team? No, it wasn't. Only superstar player they had was Steph Curry. People think they was a super team because they was making the playoffs year in and year out. Now when they got KD, is it a super team? Well, let's go ahead and look at the formula. KD, franchise player. Steph Curry's franchise player. What did I say? It's okay to have two franchise players. Klay Thompson, was he a franchise player? No, but he was an all-star. Was Draymond Green an all-star? Yes, but those two players alone, would no team build no championship team around them. Don't matter how good they was that year. Don't matter if Klay shot made 400 threes in the season. That don't mean he was a franchise player. He had a good season. He was a good player. This is before the injury. He was a good player. Was it a super team? No, it was two superstars with two all-star players. And one of the all-star players, you didn't really need him for scoring. He was not there for scoring. He just did the intangibles. So we supposed to say that they're a super team because they got Klay Thompson? Remember what I said, two superstars and an all-star don't mean that it's a super team. It's more like a big three. You can almost say that Golden State team was a big four. But I don't see them as a super team. That's just me. Everybody else might got a different opinion on what is a super team to them. And, I'm not trying to be biased. I'm just calling it and using the same formula that I went all the way back in the 80s and used that same formula going forward. Yes, Shaq and Kobe was superstar players. But if they had another all-star on their team, and I can't remember if they did or not during those runs, that don't mean they was a super team. If they had Mitch Richmond at one time or Glenn Rice, those players was at the back end, but I think one of those players was an all-star that year. I want to say it was Glenn Rice. I have to go back. You see what I'm saying? But at that moment, even if he was an all-star, if it was Glenn Rice, didn't nobody say, oh yeah, Glenn Rice, you could build a team around him. So let's keep the same energy for Klay Thompson because Glenn Rice was the three-point shooter. Klay Thompson is the three-point shooter. Ain't nobody ever said, let's build a team around Klay Thompson. And if you ever said it, then you're just trying to fit an argument for yourself. Okay? So, with that said, I don't think that was a super team. Let's look at that Cleveland Cavaliers team. Kevin Love, franchise player. LeBron James, franchise player. Kyrie Irving, franchise player. Ding, 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 ding. Super team. Super team. You see what I'm saying? Super team. It don't matter who else they had on their team. They had three franchise players in their prime. Well, Golden State had three players. Let me say this again. Klay Thompson was never a franchise player. He was an all-star, but he was a franchise player. Was nobody building anything around Klay Thompson. And if you felt like you needed to build a team around Klay Thompson, good luck on that. Because there's a lot of people that'll say some silly things and say Klay Thompson was better than Reggie Miller. But that's a different podcast for a different day. That's a different show for a different day. But Cleveland was a super team. If we want to go to another team, let me think of another team. Boston. They had Gordon Hayward, Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart. Marcus Smart was drafted to be a franchise player, but after one season or two seasons, you could tell that he wasn't a franchise player and he probably wasn't going to be an all-star type of player. Real good, but wasn't that player. Now, Gordon Hayward, on the other hand, was considered a franchise player coming from Utah before he went to Boston. Jaylen Brown, drafted real high in the draft. Some people still think if you put him on and give him his own team and build a team around him, he could be a franchise player. And the same thing with Tatum. Was that a super team? I believe it was. Because Gordon Hayward, even though his injury slowed him down, but if he didn't have those injury problems, he still would have been playing at a high level because that year in Utah, he had a great year. And then when he went to Boston, he was supposed to be the leader of the team. And then got injured on opening night. Or it was either opening night or the first week. And he had that gruesome injury. He was supposed to go to Boston, and the Boston was adding him to Boston with a young Tatum and Jaylen Brown. That was supposed to be his team, and they were supposed to be primed for a run to the finals. But that injury derailed everything, and he was not the same player since. And then when he came back, let me think about this one. When he came back, was it still a super team? When he got there, it was considered a super team. But when he came back and got it after his injury, I couldn't say it was a super team because he was no longer a franchise player. That injury derailed him, and he was no longer a franchise player. He was a very good player, but I don't even think he even rebounded to be an all-star player. So no, that Boston team was not a super team. When he got there, they was a super team. If it's any Kelvin, catch JB, catch Jermaine, and their videos and their perspective on sports and sports history and teams. And until then, I'm out. You know what? Let me come back, man. I left a couple teams off the subject. So let's go to that Brooklyn team with Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and James Harden. Is that a super team? Kevin Durant still playing at a superstar level, franchise level. Um, James Harden, even though he don't show up in the playoffs, he's still, I want to say he's at the back end of his prime. And Kyrie Irving is pretty much at the back end of his prime. Like I said, you could be old and your window can expand, but I'll say Kyrie still in his prime. Kevin Durant still in his prime, but James Harden, he's not a franchise player no more. He can't lead a team. And if you want to build a team around James Harden right now, I think that's silly. But so do I look at that team as a super team? No. And that's because James Harden was no longer a franchise player. They had two franchise players and an all-star. Most recently, you got Bradley Beal, Devin Booker, and Kevin Durant playing with the Suns. Is that a super team? Yes. Kevin Durant is still playing. He's still a franchise will still build around him even if it's for 2 years. Bradley Beal is a franchise player. He was the franchise player in Washington for a long time. He's still in his prime. Same thing with Devin Booker. As a franchise player with the Suns, he's still in his prime. So is that a super team? Yes, it is. That is a super team.